Hello and welcome back, Texas listeners. So, today's episode, we're going to focus in on what you can do on your resume to actually improve your resume without prior experience. So, everything projects, competitions, open source coding, and hackathons. So, let me start this with a preface that I am simply a software engineer who got interviews at all of the major tech companies that were kind of my top tech companies. So one could say that my resume was incredibly effective by the time that I graduated. That being said, I did that with a school that, while I deeply adore my school, doesn't come with much prestige and doesn't even have a GPA. So I kind of had to learn how to overcome some of the traditional things that a lot of people focus on when it comes to their resume as a new grad. I am not, though, a manager nor a recruiter. So all I can say is what worked for me. But it's better than what a lot of advice people will give that is honestly out of your control. If you don't have a job, how are you supposed to add experience to your resume? In reality, it's not that helpful. So I'm going to give you some actionable insights based on my own experience. So for me, one of the big things that I started doing in my free time while in school was actually cybersecurity competitions. Obviously, these aren't the best fit for people who aren't interested in cybersecurity. For me, what it did was it allowed me to have yet another avenue of showing how I'm interested in tech beyond just the paycheck. Because at the end of the day, it's easy to get complacent even if you're getting paid a lot. And so a lot of companies really want to see that you're actually going to be interested in what you're working on. Are you going to be keeping up with the trends in your own time? Are you going to be passionate about whatever you're working on? These things make you a better employee. So a lot of companies will be trying to see from your resume if they can kind of weed that out. For me, doing cybersecurity competitions was initially just a way for me to learn more about cybersecurity, participate in it more. I happen to do particularly well. And so on my resume, I do include not just that I participated in cybersecurity competitions, but how I did in them, as I typically wound up in the top 5% of participants in several thousand people competing. So I would say if what you're doing isn't something where you're getting ranked against other people, that's also perfectly fine. If your ranking isn't very good and you are getting ranked against other people, I'd leave the ranking out. But things like coding competitions, these things can help show that you're just interested in coding. One thing that I see decently often, though, that I don't recommend including in your resume is the amount of LeetCode code you do. Honestly, I don't care. Most people in industry don't care. And to a certain degree, it makes it look like you're almost obsessive about memorizing problems, whereas really what we're looking for in an engineer is a lot harder to describe than simply, hey, do a bunch of LeetCode problems. I've seen countless people online say, hey, I'm in the top 1% of LeetCode or I'm in the top 10% of LeetCode. What does that tell me about you as an engineer? And the reality is, it doesn't tell me much. So I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend finding things that do tell me things about you as an engineer. So competitions, they're great, especially if you do them in your own time and you just do them for the sake of learning and seeing how you're doing and potentially growing your skills. The next thing that's really, really helpful to include on your resume, if you have the ability to, is if you work on anything open source. This is one of my top recommendations for if you're really having a hard time breaking into industry, is to actually go and work on some open source software and make some contributions. This brings a lot of things to the table that you get to learn that typically you won't get to learn until you actually start working otherwise. So you're working with other people's code, which is something that so many of us never got to do in college. And so it's really one of the hard skills that you have to really pick up in order to be successful once you break into industry. So open source, you're going to be working with other people's code. So you're going to have to learn how to deal with that. You also, therefore, have to be comfortable with reading code and interpreting code that isn't yours. Once again, a skill that is used every single day in industry, but honestly, very little of our college curriculum focuses in on. So not only are you getting things that are super helpful in industry, but you're covering gaps that most people have. Also, within open source, you usually have fairly high standards for contribution. So you're learning generally quality kind of code construction. You're learning really, how to write code that others think will work and is respectable. So if you don't have experience, one of the closest things you could possibly do is to go ahead and contribute to open source and get involved in the open source community. A lot of companies also have open source software that they leverage. So if you really, really, really know what team you want to work on or what project you want to work on, and they happen to use open source, especially if they work on something open source, you can actually become a known entity to them even before you apply. This is one of the big helpful secrets that a lot of people don't even realize could happen is you could actually be asked to apply to certain jobs depending on if they're using code that you've helped write, especially if they hear that you're doing that because you're looking for a job and you want to have all of those skills that you're going to be using every single day. So the best thing that you could do if you happen to have the time to contribute to it is open source software. But it is generally a little bit of a learning curve beyond what other things I'm going to mention here. So it does often wind up being a bit of a time commitment, but it does have a lot of bang for that time. If you're not going to contribute to open source, and no harm with that. I never actually contributed to open source, but I do know a lot of people who did. And I also find it incredibly impressive on resumes of people, regardless on their industries, if they're in industry or not already, but especially if they're not yet in industry, that says a lot about them. But the other thing you can do is projects. So a lot of people give the advice of don't include projects that are kind of initiated by classes or are guided projects on things like Coursera. I honestly couldn't disagree much more. At the end of the day, especially when you're a new grad, or if you're looking for an internship, it can be really hard to actually fill out that whole one page of a focused resume. So at the end of the day, including more projects is better. And even if they are from your school. To this day, I still have projects on my resume that are both guided projects through Coursera and projects that I did through school. I also have some that I did completely solo. So let's talk about kind of some of the differences of school projects, guided projects, and solo projects. So school projects. Pretty much everybody with a computer science degree should have some project background. If you are just bringing into industry, projects should be on your resume. And most likely they'll stay there for quite a while. And ultimately, what school projects typically involve are you're going to generally have simpler problem statements. You're going to have a little bit clearer defined boundaries than a lot of what we have in industry. But at the end of the day, a project is a project. You're still learning. You're still showing that you can write code that compiles, that works, that does what you want it to do. What I want to include in that is in my resume, you don't know which projects are through what. And honestly, that's kind of intentional. At the end of the day, the goal of my projects isn't to get an A on that project. If it was for a class, what was my goal depended on what the project was. So, for instance, my school was really, really great about projects and about big projects. So, one of my projects was actually around the basis of designing a system to deliver packages to different addresses in a fashion that was conscientious of distance traveled. So, basically, traveling salesman problem. And what I had to do was solve that problem and actually had to not only implement code that worked for it, but I had to write a paper that compared the different potential algorithm solutions and why I went with the one that I did. Because as people often know, traveling salesman does not currently have a completely solved answer. It's a constantly evolving NP complete problem. So ultimately, my project is phrased as, hey, I wrote this packaging delivering software that is basically a take on the traveling salesman problem. It talks about the technologies that I used. It talks about the database that I used. It talks about the different challenges of the project, but it doesn't mention that it was for school. That's information that I'll happily tell a recruiter or interviewer if they ask. I have no shame in that being from school, but at the same time, the focus is on what I actually was trying to solve. One of the things with school projects that's especially important, though, is to be clear on what pieces of the work you did. For a lot of schools, there's a lot of group projects. I personally didn't have any of that because I went to a college that was self-paced. And so I did all of my projects completely solo. But for a lot of schools, there's group projects, and those come with pros and cons. They're great at teaching you how to work with other people's code, which is a struggle when you first have to. And it's definitely, the learning curve is steep on that one. And so it's great in that way, but you do need to be clear on which portions of the project you did. And you want to be clear on your resume. So I point blank say that I did all of the work for designing and implementing every system on my resume because I did. If you wrote a smaller portion, but you helped project manage the team, cool, mention it. Make it really clear what you did, because that just helps make it so that you're not getting asked questions that you then have to say, I don't know about the projects on your resume, because you should be able to answer the questions that come up. The next kind of project that I have on my resume and that I recommend in general is guided projects. These are available through all sorts of online courses. I personally leverage Coursera. I also have seen some really good ones on blogs, on YouTube. There's so many options out there and so many ideas where people actually walk you through step-by-step how to do the problem. So these are great for things that you're not as familiar with, that you really wouldn't know where to start with. So one of my favorite guided projects that I've ever actually done was my first project within computer vision and within processing of photos in a machine learning setting. So what it is it's a project that I took a Coursera course on that actually goes through a set of images of x-rays of people's lungs. And it has the option to identify if you trained the model to identify if they had COVID, if they had viral pneumonia, or if they had healthy lungs based on those images. That is not something that I had enough experience in to even know where to begin. And so it was really great to get to build this project start to finish, all while learning how to do this. So guided projects can be great. Be clear once again on which portions you did. I didn't completely write the model. We used an existing model for that project, and that's clear on my resume. On my resume, I make it very clear that I trained the model, that I tested the model, and that then I did all of the evaluation and kind of iteration of some of it, but that I did not create the model. And I also include exactly which model we used. So guided projects, the main thing on them is that they should be things that you're really interested in. And in general, they should be things that you kind of want to dabble in to figure out if this is what you want to do. Machine learning is one of the most popular skill sets to try and learn these days, especially within the world of computing. So it's awesome that I was able to kind of dabble in machine learning a little bit more while I was waiting for my job to get lined up. And I got to learn a lot that I do actually still use in my job to this day. From there, the final kind of project that I most often see is completely solo projects. So these are projects that you completely came up with by yourself. You might use tutorials for some pieces to help you learn how to do certain things, but the concept is yours and it's uniquely yours. So for instance, I, a few years ago, decided I was going to write an Android app that was going to be able to track mental health symptoms for mental health patients so that when they see their psychiatrist once a year, they're able to actually visually see the visualizations for that data on their symptoms. And basically they'll be able to actually see like, oh, while this week has been really good or this month has been really good, in general, the last year hasn't been good. And so maybe I do need a med adjustment. Because otherwise it can be really, really hard for people to know how they're doing in perspective of the larger picture instead of just where they're at now. So I came up with that idea. I decided I was going to write it for Android. I had never written Android before. And so I did use a lot of Android courses to kind of figure out how to do each step here and there. But there's not some course out there online on how to do the project that I did. These projects are simultaneously awesome for your resume and really hard because you can run into hurdles that you didn't see coming. For instance, I hadn't really thought through as much as I would have wanted the fact that HIPAA laws, of course, still apply to technology that is using our health data. And that because technology leveraging health data is so new, those laws are changing all the time. And so in general, it would have taken me needing like a legal department to actually ever launch this app. And so for me, that's a project that I never actually fully completed because there was a hurdle that wasn't going to be overcome, even though I had most of the app done. And so solo projects can have those roadblocks. And a lot of companies and interviewers don't necessarily appreciate that. In my experience, a lot of them were really turned off to the fact that like my project isn't going to be in the Android store because it would violate health data laws because I don't have a background in law and can't interpret all of the laws that exist in that area. So I would say that solo projects are great, but bigger solo projects are really, really hard to actually do well. And if you're not going to be able to complete it and to guarantee that you're going to complete it, I recommend other projects, honestly, because just like as far as your resume goes, it doesn't help to launch things and not land them when it comes to projects for your resume. Now, for your own learning, cool, do it. I've never fully given up on potentially making my own symptom tracking app that I use personally. But simultaneously, I don't keep having that on my resume. So solo projects, you learn so much. I once had somebody in an interview refer to learning Android solo as diving the Marianas Trench. And that's fairly accurate. It is a lot of information, and you are definitely choosing to drink directly from the fire hose. So it comes with its pros and cons. Some people will look really well upon it on your resume, but if it's not complete, if it's not perfect, you might run into a little bit more pushback on solo projects. Another thing that you can do to help improve your resume is hackathons. I personally have never actually found time to participate in hackathons, but they're great for being able to work with other people on code, have a lot of the same kind of benefits of open source, except for you're doing it in person. So there's a lot less spin up and a lot more support for if you're newer for the most part. They're also just great to show that you're passionate about technology, because at the end of the day, that's one of the biggest things, because this is a always moving industry. So you have to be really excited about what you're doing in order to be successful. Eventually, the money alone will not be a big enough motivator. And a lot of companies know that. And so they are looking for people who are genuinely excited about what can we do with these technologies. And all of these things help you figure out what you like to do. So hackathons, colleges will often have them. You can sometimes find some online. I would say the most common method of finding them that I'm aware of is colleges. And since my college was really untraditional, we didn't really have anything such as a hackathon. So I didn't ever actually participate in them. But you can definitely find some here and there. I guess I did participate in one with Twitter back in the day when there was still Twitter. They had what they referred to as Coachella. And that was a really fun virtual weekend of hackathon, and they did a bunch of workshop sessions. And so some companies will have them if you search online and kind of look. But also, if you just are involved in kind of where people are recruiting for tech, some companies might reach out to you and have things like opportunities to participate in things like Coachella, which was a really fun experience. One of the other things that I personally do that has helped set apart my resume in the world of tech, and that other people can do too, is volunteering within the world of tech. So I personally have a handful of things that I do as a volunteer to help get more people involved in tech and stay really involved in tech. And so one of them is I'm involved in FIRST Robotics. I mentor a team. I'm a programming mentor. So on my resume, I have that I'm a programming mentor, and I actually am responsible for teaching a group of about 12 high schoolers how to write an Android app to decide what teams we wanted to work with at competitions over the span of summer. And also I help teach high schoolers computer vision at this point. And so that's a cool thing to be able to put on my resume. And on top of that, I also, for a way longer, have been a volunteer and have helped in technical roles and helped with troubleshooting. I talk on my resume in almost every interview about how I regularly am the volunteer who helps troubleshooting anything with their robot. I'm one of the few in my area who does both software, electrical, and mechanical troubleshooting. And so I'll have teams come to me and be like, hey, our elevator isn't working. And I am responsible for figuring out not only why is it not working, but how do we fix it? And under immense time pressure, because every minute is a minute that they potentially are missing matches. And so this helped form a really good troubleshooting background for me and a really good ability to handle ambiguity. Unfortunately, in industry, a lot of the times we don't get really clear answers right away. You kind of have to figure it out a little. And so I learned a lot of those skills through volunteering in robotics. I also help run Unified Robotics, which is a nonprofit focused on getting students with and without disabilities to work together on teams to build robots and compete together. And so I've been involved as like the director of events for Unified Robotics for the last 7 or so years of my life. And while that seems like a little bit of a side tangent, simultaneously, It refines my ability to communicate with anybody about technical concepts. And that's an immensely helpful skill to have within industry, because so often your project manager might not be as technical, your manager might not be as technical, your skip level might not be as technical. There's so many times that being able to break down technical concepts to non-technical parties is really important. And the other thing as well is just it starts a conversation. It's something unique about me that people will remember from my resume usually. And it says that I genuinely believe that technology is for everybody. And that I'm really passionate about that. Like, I don't just say that. I put in tons of time to make that the case. And so at the end of the day, there's a lot of different ways to be involved with getting more people involved in technology. There's Black Girls Code, there's Girls Who Code, there's Women Who Code, there's if you're interested in cybersecurity, get involved with a cybersecurity organization. There's so many opportunities to feedback into the community, and it's never too early to feedback. But that's another way to kind of get some of those skills that we don't necessarily get to practice in a classroom as much. Ultimately, at the end of the day, there's a lot that can be said about what you have on your resume. And so many people focus on, perfecting the format of their resume. But at the end of the day, if the material there isn't great, your format isn't going to make the difference. And you can only do so much about your school, about your GPA, about, if you're not getting good responses, I highly recommend going and simultaneously to applying. You don't have to stop applying, but see if you can find a project or a, open source piece of software that you're excited to go work on, and simultaneously work on that to add it to your resume, to constantly be improving your resume so that it is unique to you. And ultimately, you want to feed all of those projects and things back, and make sure that anytime you're adding something to your resume, you're asking, what does this say about me? And why would a company value this? So for me, volunteering with robotics, it says that I'm able to troubleshoot under pressure. Why does the company care? Because that's what a lot of engineering actually is. When it comes to me working with high schoolers, what does it say? I can lead a team. I can teach people new things, and I can keep up with the pace, even when I have minimal Android background myself. So hopefully this chat was a little bit helpful and gave you a little bit of inspiration on how to kind of further polish your resume if you're looking at breaking into the tech industry or potentially looking for a new job within the tech industry. I hope to kind of change your mindset on just finalizing what's already there and continue to add and make it your own. If you're passionate about something and you want to learn about it, find a project and add it to your resume. That's what I did. I have a general computer science degree, and I have specialized in cybersecurity with a little bit of machine learning thrown in there. And I actually get to do both of those in my job these days. So ultimately, you can make yourself fit into a niche. You just might not be able to do that with a general class load, with a general computer science degree, or with a software engineering degree or whatever. And so projects are so useful, and make sure that you have a diversity of projects. They each should say something slightly different about your skill sets. And ultimately, at the end, you should be able to look at them and then look at a job that you're applying for and say, I'm able to prove that I have all the skills that they're looking for, because that's what they want. And therefore, that's what you want. So thanks for listening. Hopefully this podcast episode on resume projects and side work is helpful. And hopefully you all have an even better job hunt if you're doing one. And if you have other advice, feel free to include it anywhere on our socials, and we're happy to continue this conversation. Until next time. Bye.